Somewhere in the North Atlantic, far from any coast a sailor could name, a ship slows. The wind has dropped. The water around the hull has changed colour, darker, colder, almost still. And then something moves beneath the surface. Not a wave, not a whale breaking to breathe. Something vast and unhurried, half visible through fathoms of black water, trailing shapes that don't quite resolve into anything a man could name when he got home. He would try, of course. They always tried. The accounts survive in royal chronicles, in the margins of natural histories, in the logs of missionaries crossing Greenland, in the poetry of ancient civilizations that had never met each other, yet somehow described the same thing. A coiled shape, a creature that could drag a ship down, something long and dark that moved against the current and then was gone. For centuries, we called these things monsters and left it at that. We painted them on maps in the spaces where knowledge ran out, enormous and writhing, with the implicit message that beyond this point the world stops making sense. The earliest surviving world maps to include such creatures date to the 10th century, and by 1539, when the Swedish cartographer Olaus Magnus published his extraordinary Carta Marina, the waters off Norway were filled with sea serpents he described as stretching 60 to 180 metres in length. Creatures so large they were said to overturn ships by coiling around their hulls. Were those sailors lying, hallucinating, exaggerating out of fear or a desire to make a good story better? Sometimes, yes, but not always. And that is what makes this so interesting. The word kraken appears in written record as early as 1180 in a Norwegian chronicle compiled during the reign of King Sverre, a massive tentacled thing lurking in the deep water off the Scandinavian coast. Aristotle, writing centuries before that, recorded what he called a fallen dragon spotted in the eastern Mediterranean, a creature approximately 30 metres long, an account preserved through the naturalist tradition until it was simply filed away as myth. The biblical Leviathan, described in the book of Job with fire in its breath and scales like shields of bronze, appears 6 times across the Old Testament, drawing from a much older tradition, Near Eastern chaos myths featuring Lotan and Tiamat, serpentine forces older than any sea voyage we can trace. These are not isolated stories. They form a pattern. Across cultures that shared no contact, sailors and scholars and religious scribes kept encountering something, or kept believing they had, and the descriptions rhyme across centuries in ways that are difficult to dismiss. So this video is about a question that sounds simple and turns out to be genuinely complicated. What did they actually see? Not what did they want to see, or what their mythology had prepared them to see, though those things matter too. What was in the water? The answer, as it turns out, is layered. Some accounts are clearly symbolic, theological statements dressed as natural observation, designed to express awe or power rather than describe a creature someone had actually encountered. Some are honest mistakes, made by people doing their best in poor light, on exhausted minds, at the wrong angle, with a horizon full of unfamiliar shapes. And some, this is the part that should catch your attention, are surprisingly close to real animals that science would not formally confirm until the 21st century. In 2005, a research team using a remote-operated submersible captured the first footage ever taken of a live giant squid in its natural habitat. The animal was enormous. The species, Architeuthis dux, can reach 18 metres in length. It has eyes the size of dinner plates. It hunts in deep water and occasionally surfaces, sometimes dead, sometimes not, leaving behind exactly the kind of evidence that would make a reasonable sailor reconsider his understanding of the world. That footage closed a loop that had been open for 800 years. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. What we're going to do over the course of this video is treat the monster tradition as what it actually is, a historical record that requires careful reading. We'll follow the kraken from its first written appearance in a Norse chronicle, through Linnaeus's decision to include it in his scientific taxonomy in 1735, which is one of the stranger footnotes in the history of biology, all the way to that 2005 submersible footage that proved the ocean had been hiding something close to the legend all along. We'll trace the sea serpent from Aristotle's Mediterranean dragon, through the elaborate illustrations of medieval cartography, and into the 19th century, when sightings became a public obsession, and the line between scientific inquiry and showmanship collapsed almost completely. We'll read the Leviathan not just as scripture, but as a document embedded in a much older tradition, and we'll ask what animal, if any, it was ever meant to describe, And throughout all of this, we'll keep returning to the people who were actually there. The Norwegian fishermen, the Greenland missionaries, the naturalists who risked their professional reputations to argue that something real lived in the deep water, the sailors who wrote in their logs and knew, even as they wrote, that no one would believe them. This is not a myth-debunking exercise. The point isn't to prove that the monsters were fake and the sailors were foolish. The point is to understand what it meant to sail into water that no map could describe, to encounter something your language had no word for, and to reach for the largest, strangest thing your imagination could offer. The ocean earned those monsters. What it hid was sometimes even stranger. To understand where the monsters came from, you have to spend a little time inside the world that made them. Imagine a watch in the North Atlantic, sometime in the 12th century. The ship is small by any modern standard, a working vessel of perhaps 20 to 30 meters, crewed by men who have been at sea for weeks. It is 3 a.m. The fog has come down so completely that the lantern at the bow lights nothing but its own reflection. The horizon, on a clear day, sits only about 3 miles away for a man standing 6 feet above the water, a biological fact of geometry, a hard limit built into human vision at sea level. In fog, that margin collapses to meters. The sailor on watch cannot see the bow of his own ship. He can hear the water, he can feel the cold working through his clothes. He has not slept properly in 4 days. In that state, the ocean becomes something other than a physical place. It becomes a problem of perception. Exhaustion alone does strange things to vision. Mariners who have written about long watches describe seeing shapes that resolve and dissolve, forms that appear to have intention, movement, scale. Modern accounts from single-handed sailors confirm that sleep deprivation produces genuine hallucinations, not just wishful thinking. Hallucinations of figures on deck, of obstacles that vanish on approach, of vast shapes riding parallel in the dark. Now extend that condition to an entire crew, working rotating watches for weeks in cold and noise and confinement, and you begin to understand how a partially surfaced whale, a raft of kelp, or the arching back of a basking shark could, in the right light, at the right distance, become something that demanded explanation. The physics of the ocean added its own tricks. A fata morgana, the complex superior mirage produced when a layer of warm air sits above cold water and bends light in extraordinary ways, can vertically stretch distant ships until they resemble towers, or transform a flat coastline into something that appears to hang above the horizon like a wall. These mirages appear suddenly, shift as conditions change, and vanish without explanation. A crew who witnessed one for the first time had no optical physics to reach for. They had only the vocabulary of the monstrous. Then there was fear, not irrational fear, but the calibrated, well-earned fear of people who knew exactly how easily a ship could be lost. When a whale surfaced unexpectedly close to a hull and dove again, displacing the water around it, the vessel actually moved. That physical shock, the lurch and the sound, was real. The interpretation of what caused it was the variable. A massive whale's back breaking the surface in poor light, its flukes lifting as it sounds, the whole movement slow and enormous and wrong in a way that nothing on land ever moved. That image, processed by an exhausted and frightened mind at 3 a.m, had nowhere useful to go. The monster was not a failure of intelligence. It was the best available explanation. Fear also travelled. This is what the records show clearly. Sailors talked. Port towns were information networks long before anyone thought of them that way. A crew arriving in Bergen or Lisbon or Bristol carried their sightings with them, and those accounts moved through taverns and chandleries and dockside conversations the way any news moved, with elaboration, with the natural pressure of a good story to grow larger in each telling. By the time the account reached the merchant who hired the ship, or the mapmaker who incorporated the story into his chart, or the naturalist who recorded it in his correspondence, the original sighting had passed through enough hands to have acquired details that no single witness ever saw. The 1817 Gloucester sea serpent is a useful illustration of how quickly this could happen. A creature was sighted off the Massachusetts coast by multiple witnesses, including the crew of a schooner who reportedly fired a cannon at it. Within weeks, the sighting had been published in newspapers across New England. A committee of the Linnaean Society, the same learned body connected to the tradition of Linnaeus, launched a formal investigation and produced a published report. The report spread the story further lending it institutional credibility. What had begun as an encounter, strange, uncertain, possibly a misidentified animal, had become within months a documented scientific inquiry, and the creature had gained a geography, a behaviour, and a cultural life entirely independent of whatever was actually in the water that day. This is the mechanism behind the recurring monster motifs. It is not that sailors across different centuries and different cultures were all seeing the same impossible animal. It is that they were working in the same conditions: limited visibility, physical exhaustion, the compressed intensity of life at sea, and their reports entered the same channels: the port, the scholarly text, the sailor's yarn that travelled from ship to ship across a whole ocean of conversation. A Norwegian fisherman's account of something vast and tentacled in the deep water off Lofoten, passed through enough tellings, begins to resemble a Breton sailor's account of a coiling shape off the coast of Finisterre. The details converge not because the creatures were identical, but because the human experience of seeing something inexplicable in deep water is, across cultures, remarkably consistent. The sea was both a workplace and a frontier, and frontiers have always been where monsters live. Not in the water necessarily, but in the gap between what can be observed and what can be explained. Every sailor who watched something surface and sink without resolving into anything familiar was standing at that gap. Most of them reached for the largest word they had. What they reached toward in many cases was older than any of their ships, far older than the ocean routes they sailed. The word oldest is doing real work here, because the tradition of the giant sea creature does not begin with medieval Norse sailors or Roman legionaries. It begins far earlier, in civilizations built along rivers and coastlines, where the deep water was already understood as a place of primordial danger, a place that preceded human order and could, at any moment, swallow it whole. In ancient Babylon, the creation story known as the Enuma Elish opens with a being named Tiamat. She is not a monster in the later decorative sense, not a creature placed in the margins of a story to be defeated and forgotten. She is the sea itself, or rather, she is the chaos that the sea represented before the gods imposed structure on the world. Scholars describe her as a sea dragon, a primordial serpent of enormous scale whose body, when finally destroyed in the myth, becomes the material of creation, the sky, and the earth pressed from her divided form. That image, the vast sea creature, as both destroyer and foundation of the world, would echo through every culture that inherited or independently reached the same idea. The Ugaritic texts of what is now coastal Syria, written somewhere between 1400 and 1200 BCE, describe a creature named Lotan, a coiled, seven-headed serpent of the sea, defeated by the storm god Baal. Scholars have traced this figure almost directly into the Hebrew tradition. The name itself transforms. Lotan becomes Leviathan, the great twisted thing of the waters, which we will return to in a moment. What matters here is the geography. These are not inland stories. Ugarit was a port city, a major commercial hub on the eastern Mediterranean coast, and its people knew the sea in practical terms, as trade route, as weather, as the boundary at the edge of the known. When they described Lotan, they were placing a specific kind of danger in a specific kind of place. The seven heads may be symbolic. The body of water was real. Across the same Mediterranean world, the Greeks were building their own version of the same figure. Cetus, the sea monster sent to devour Andromeda on the rocks of the Levantine coast. The Hydra, multi-headed and regenerating, living in the swampy water at the edge of the inhabitable land. Scylla, half woman, half cluster of serpentine necks, stationed in the strait between what is now Italy and Sicily, a strait where the currents and the rocks genuinely killed sailors and where wreckage genuinely accumulated. These creatures were not invented from nothing. They were anchored to specific coastlines, specific stretches of dangerous water, specific places where ships were known to be lost. But then something interesting happens. Around the 3rd century BCE, the mythic tradition begins to acquire a new kind of witness. People who describe what they claim to have personally seen, or what they claim to have been reliably told by those who did. This is the transition that makes the ancient sea serpent so difficult to simply dismiss, and so easy to misread. The story is no longer being told as cosmology. It is being told as natural history. Aristotle, in his Historia Animalium, records an account of a creature found on the Levantine coast, specifically in Syria. He calls it a fallen dragon, and he describes its body as approximately 1 plethrum in length. A plethrum was a Greek unit of measurement roughly equivalent to 100 feet or 30 meters. By any standard, that is an enormous animal. What makes the account arresting is how Aristotle presents the scale. He notes that the creature's corpse was so wide that horsemen standing on opposite sides of it could not see each other across the body. He is not describing a mythic sea serpent in the allegorical tradition of Tiamat or Lotan. He's presenting a physical observation about a physical object, presented in units and with a specific geographic location. Now, whether Aristotle witnessed this himself or was relaying a second-hand account is unclear, and the line between observation and elaboration in ancient texts is genuinely contested territory. But the crucial point is that he chose to include it in a work that was, by its own standards, an attempt at systematic natural inquiry. He placed the sea serpent, long, enormous, real-bodied, inside the literature of what things actually exist. Strabo, the Greek geographer writing in the last decades before the Common Era, returns to the same creature through a different route. He cites the philosopher Posidonius, who described first-hand an encounter on the same stretch of Syrian coastline. The serpent Posidonius reported was not merely long, but architecturally impressive in its individual parts. Scales the size of shields, jaws wide enough that a man on horseback could ride into them without ducking. Strabo includes this not in a section on mythology, but in a passage engaged with the geography and natural conditions of the Eastern Mediterranean. He treats it as something that needs to be noted because it was apparently witnessed, even as he maintains the careful distance of the geographer who is assembling reports rather than personally vouching for each one. This is the crucial move that Strabo and others made so naturally that we can almost miss it. The blurring of report and marvel. Strabo compiled an enormous geography of the known world. He included accounts of strange peoples and strange animals, alongside measurements of coastlines and descriptions of harbours. He did not always signal which claims he accepted and which he doubted. The sea serpent sits in his text next to verifiable geography, given the same prose rhythm as a description of a trading port. That proximity to the factual lends it a weight it might not carry if it were isolated in a collection of wonders. What this body of ancient writing establishes, well before the Viking Age and well before the Northern European traditions that most people associate with sea monsters, is a specific set of characteristics that recur with remarkable consistency. The creature is long, not just large in some general sense, but elongated, sinuous, covering a span that the human eye struggles to contain as a single object. It is only partly visible at any one time. Ancient accounts almost always describe something breaking the surface in segments, or lying beached so that the full extent of the body exceeds what observers can see from any single position. It is immense in relation to human scale. Not merely large, but large in a way that reorganizes the space around it, making riders invisible to each other, making jaws into archways, and it is coastal, specifically tied to real bodies of water, real stretches of coast, with names and positions on the ancient maps that already existed. That last point is worth holding. The sea serpent in these ancient accounts is not a creature of the open ocean, the featureless deep, the truly unknown. It appears on the shores of the Levant, in the straits of the Greek islands, in the ports and coastal shallows of the civilized world. This is not a monster of ignorance, a creature placed where the map runs out. It is a monster at the edge of the known, which is a different and more interesting thing. The sailors and geographers who encountered or reported it were not confused people with no knowledge of the sea. They were experts in their watery world, and they encountered something that exceeded the categories their expertise had given them. When later writers, in the medieval period and beyond, began describing sea serpents along the coasts of Norway or off the shores of Greenland, they were not originating a tradition. They were inheriting one that was already more than 1,000 years old, already linked to real coastlines, already equipped with a very specific body plan, the long, sinuous, partially visible, impossibly immense shape that had been accumulating descriptive detail since before Aristotle put it into his natural history. The body plan was set. The creature had a literature and a geography. What it still needed for the next 2,000 years of its existence was an explanation. That explanation would take many forms, some of them mythological, some of them fraudulent, and some of them eventually surprisingly accurate. But before any of that could happen, the sea serpent had one more ancient transformation to undergo. It needed to become something older and more terrible than a fallen dragon on a Syrian beach. It needed to become the creature that swallowed the light itself. That transformation had already happened, in a text far older than Aristotle's Natural History and far stranger than any geographer's field notes. The Book of Job is not a simple document. It is one of the most contested, debated, and philosophically dense texts in the entire biblical canon, a poem framed as a story about suffering, justice, and the limits of human understanding. And near its end, in one of the most extraordinary passages in ancient literature, God speaks directly from a whirlwind, and the argument God makes is essentially this: you are small, and the world is larger and stranger than your categories allow. As evidence, the voice from the whirlwind invokes a creature called Leviathan. The description that follows across the 41st chapter of Job is worth reading slowly, because it is doing several things at once. It describes a being with scales locked together like rows of shields, so close that no air can pass between them. It describes breath that sets coals ablaze and flame that issues from its mouth. It describes a neck so strong that terror moves ahead of it, and a back like rows of shields, and a heart as hard as stone. The sea churns white in its wake. Whatever it is, it cannot be caught with a hook, or bound with a cord, or tamed with a treaty. It was made, the text insists, as a demonstration of something, of the magnitude of what creation contains, of the distance between what humans can manage and what actually exists. This is not a zoological passage. It is a theological argument delivered in the form of a natural history. But that does not mean the creature is purely invented. The name gives us the first clue about what tradition it is drawing from. In Hebrew, the word is Leviathan, and it is built on a root meaning to twist or coil. The Leviathan is, in its name, the twisted one, the coiled one, the creature defined by its sinuous form. That etymology is not incidental. It places Leviathan inside an ancient category of serpentine, water-dwelling chaos that appears across the Near Eastern world under different names but with consistent features. The long body, the coiling motion, the association with deep water and primordial disorder. The name is a description and a genealogy at the same time. The genealogy leads directly to Lotan, the seven-headed sea serpent of the Ugaritic texts that the previous chapter introduced. Scholars of ancient Near Eastern religion have traced the connection with some care, and the linguistic path is direct. Lotan and Leviathan share a root, and the Ugaritic myth of Baal defeating Lotan at the sea appears, in transformed but recognizable form, in the Hebrew Psalms. Psalm 74 describes God crushing the heads of Leviathan in the waters, giving its body as food to the creatures of the desert, an image that maps almost exactly onto the Ugaritic narrative of Baal's victory over the seven-headed serpent. The biblical writers knew the older myth. They reworked it, reassigning the victory to their own deity, and inscribing it within a different theological framework, but the body of the monster, its multiplicity, its association with the chaotic deep, remained. Behind Lotan, further back in the layered sediment of ancient religion, stands Tiamat, the Babylonian chaos dragon, the primordial sea, the being whose divided body became the structure of the world. The theological move across these traditions is consistent. The god of order defeats the monster of chaos, and that defeat is the founding act of creation itself. The sea was dangerous and dark and old, and the monster in the sea was the oldest thing in it, the embodiment of everything that preceded and resisted human order. Defeating it, or, in the biblical tradition, containing it, setting its limits, was the act that made habitable existence possible. This is where Leviathan becomes something other than a creature you could observe from a shoreline. In Isaiah chapter 27, the prophet invokes Leviathan as a direct symbol of Israel's enemies, the nations and powers that oppress and threaten to destroy, the fleeing serpent, the twisted serpent, the dragon in the sea that God will slay on the day of judgment. The imagery is explicitly political as well as theological. Leviathan here is not an animal. It is history as chaos, empire as monster, the crushing weight of the world's disorder given a body and a name, so that the promise of its eventual defeat can be given a body too. And yet the text keeps pulling back towards something physical. Job chapter 41 will not let Leviathan float entirely free of the natural world. The scales, the teeth, the smoke from the nostrils, the churning wake. These are the details of a creature that someone somewhere believed had been seen or at least approximated. Psalm 104 places Leviathan in the sea almost domestically, as one of the many creatures God made to move through the waters, almost a counterpoint to the terror of Job's portrait. There, Leviathan plays in the ocean, strange, immense, but present in the world alongside the ships that men sail. 6 appearances across the Old Testament, and no 2 are quite the same creature. The Leviathan of Job breathes fire and cannot be tamed. The Leviathan of the Psalms plays in the deep water and will eventually be food for the wilderness creatures. The Leviathan of Isaiah is the cosmic enemy of God and humanity. The text is not giving us a consistent natural description. It is giving us a consistent emotional and theological function. The vast, coiling, uncontrollable force of the sea and all that the sea represents, mapped onto a body that varies because the body is secondary to the meaning. Scholars attempting to identify Leviathan with a specific real animal have generated an extensive and somewhat inconclusive debate. The Nile crocodile is the most common candidate, and the match is plausible in specific ways. The armoured scales, the powerful jaws, the terrible teeth, the association with water, the behaviour that a writer describing it as unconquerable might reasonably attribute to something they had never successfully caught or killed. Crocodiles were known throughout the ancient Near East, feared along the Nile, encountered along the Levantine coast, understood as something genuinely dangerous that resisted human control. The details of the Job passage, when read carefully, do fit a very large and formidable crocodile more neatly than they fit most other candidates. The whale has also been proposed on grounds of sheer size, but this identification runs into practical difficulty almost immediately. Whales were rare in the inland seas and river systems where the biblical writers lived and worked. A whale was an unlikely object of sustained observation for a writer in the ancient Near East. The crocodile, by contrast, was ever present, culturally significant, and sufficiently terrifying that hyperbolic description of it carries its own logic. But here is where the honest difficulty lies, and it is worth naming it plainly. Separating what is theology, what is poetry, and what, if anything, is natural observation in these passages is not a problem that scholarship has solved. The writers of Job and the Psalms were not writing natural history. They were writing theology in the form of poetry, and the power of the imagery depends precisely on the creature exceeding ordinary categories. A crocodile, however large and fearsome, can in principle be killed. Leviathan, by definition, cannot, not by human hands. The fire-breathing, the unbreakable scales, the mouth as an open furnace, these are not eyewitness descriptions. They are the marks of something that has migrated from the natural world into the register of the sacred, and yet the migration is never complete. Leviathan keeps dragging pieces of actual animal back into the text with it. Scales, teeth, wake, the sea turned white behind its passing. The writers seem to need the creature to be real in some sense, to belong to the created world, precisely because its defeat or containment by God means something only if the thing being defeated is genuinely powerful and genuinely present. This tension between the symbolic and the physical is what makes Leviathan so durable and so difficult. The biblical passages are not a garbled natural history report. They are not, however, purely abstract allegory either. They sit in the space between observed world and cosmological imagination, drawing force from both, resolving neatly into neither. That space, between the animal in the water and the monster in the story, is exactly where the history of sea creatures would continue to live for the next 3,000 years. And the question that the book of Job leaves open is the same question that would occupy sailors, naturalists, and eventually scientists for centuries afterward. What animal, exactly, was enormous enough, and strange enough, and terrible enough to fill this role? What was Leviathan before it became a symbol? What did it look like in the water before someone first gave it a name? The question has been asked seriously, and it deserves a serious answer, or at least a serious attempt at one, because the honest conclusion is that no single animal closes the case. What the candidates reveal, collectively, is something more interesting than a solution. They reveal the process by which a real animal enters cultural memory and becomes, piece by piece, something larger than itself. Start with the crocodile, since it remains the most defensible identification and the one that most biblical scholars, when pressed, will lean toward. The Nile crocodile was not an abstraction to the people of the ancient Near East. It was a daily reality for anyone living along the Nile Delta, a creature of genuine terror that haunted the margins between water and land, the same liminal space that monsters traditionally occupy. Its scales are not merely hard, they are architecturally interlocking, fitting together with a precision that gives the animal a quality that is almost mechanical, almost deliberate. When Job describes Leviathan's back as rows of shields so tightly sealed that no air passes between them, the writer is describing something that an observer of large crocodiles would recognize immediately. The teeth are real, the armoured hide is real, the sudden violence is real, and, crucially for the theology, the Nile crocodile cannot be domesticated, cannot be reliably killed with weapons that would fell any other animal of comparable size, and in the ancient world was understood to exist at the edge of what could be managed or controlled. The match is strong enough that many scholars stop there, but the problem is Job chapter 41 keeps going, and the further it goes, the less the crocodile satisfies it. Smoke from the nostrils, sparks that leap from the mouth, burning torches, a belly like sharp pottery, dragging across the mire and leaving a shining trail, the deep boiling like a pot in its wake. Some of these can be rationalized. Morning breath condensing in cold air, perhaps, which a very large reptile in the Nile might produce in ways that seem dramatic. But the accumulation stretches the crocodile candidate past its natural limits. At some point, the animal is no longer merely observed. It has been enlarged by repetition, by the pressure of theological significance, by the need to match a cosmic role that no actual crocodile could fill. The whale enters the conversation at that point, offering scale where the crocodile offers only armour. A sperm whale at full size reaches approximately 20 metres and carries within its head a mass of spermaceti oil that allows it to dive to extraordinary depths, a creature genuinely shaped for the deep ocean in ways that no terrestrial observer could fully comprehend. Medieval interpreters were often drawn to the whale, partly because the tradition of identifying Leviathan with a great sea creature matched later maritime experience, and partly because the sheer body mass of a large whale comes closer than anything else alive to the sense of scale that Job invokes. When the text says that the deep boils like a pot in the creature's wake, a surfacing sperm whale, releasing its breath in a column of warm vapour and turbulent water, is not a bad match. But the whale collapses on other details, the armoured scales, the articulated rows of shields. A whale is smooth, the fierce-toothed Moor, as Job describes it. The sperm whale has teeth on the lower jaw only, and its upper jaw is smooth, which does not quite produce the image of an open furnace lined with terror on all sides. More practically, large whales were rarely seen by people in the ancient Levant. They appear occasionally in Mediterranean waters, but they were not creatures of daily familiarity to the writers of Job. They were rumoured things, edge-of-the-world things, which arguably makes them better symbols but worse explanations. The giant squid presents perhaps the most unexpected candidacy, and in some ways the most poetically satisfying one. An animal that can reach 18 metres in total length, possessing arms lined with tooth-rimmed suckers, capable of leaving circular scars on the skin of sperm whales, with eyes the size of dinner plates, and the ability to eject clouds of dark ink. This is an animal that, glimpsed incompletely from the surface, could generate almost any description a frightened observer needed to give it. The smoke and sparks of Leviathan's breath find an analogue in ink clouds and bioluminescent flashes. The ferocity of the limbs could translate, in panicked or second-hand testimony, into almost anything. The deep-sea habitat explains why no one could pin down a definitive observation. You did not find a giant squid. It found you, briefly and incompletely, in the dark. The problem is that ancient Near Eastern writers almost certainly had no regular contact with Architeuthis. The giant squid is an open ocean creature, not a coastal one. Its presence in the ancient world would have been confined to washed-up carcasses or fragments, the kind of partial evidence that generates rumours rather than sustained description. It is a poetically appealing candidate precisely because it remains so elusive, but that elusiveness is also what makes it unlikely as the primary inspiration. The extinct marine reptiles offer a different angle entirely, and one that scholars approach with understandable caution. Mosasaurs, the torpedo-shaped marine reptiles that dominated the Mesozoic seas, reached 12 metres or more, possessed powerful elongated jaws lined with conical teeth, and had bodies built for sustained aquatic pursuit. They were gone 66 million years before the first human wrote anything, and no ancient writer knew they had existed. But the bones persisted. Fossilized mosasaur remains turn up in Levantine limestone formations with some regularity. Large, dramatic, anatomically bewildering to anyone who encountered them without a framework to understand what they were looking at. A massive fossilized jaw, surfacing from eroded coastal rock, would not be identified as a prehistoric sea reptile by a Bronze Age observer. It would be identified as evidence of exactly the kind of creature that such a find seemed to prove. Bones generate stories. The bones of vanished giants generate the largest stories of all. This does not make mosasaurs the answer to Leviathan, but it creates a plausible pathway. Coastal peoples finding outsized remains, integrating those remains into existing traditions of sea monsters, and reinforcing with physical evidence a creature that already existed as cultural inheritance. This is, in fact, the most productive way to think about what Leviathan actually was. Not a single animal misidentified and then poeticized, but a composite, a cultural accumulation built from multiple sources of evidence and anxiety. The coastal peoples of the ancient Levant were not naive. They lived close to the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. They encountered large sharks, sea turtles, and whales. They fished for creatures that occasionally and violently resisted the fishing. They found bones they could not explain. They inherited myths from Babylonian and Canaanite traditions that already contained the template of the great sea monster, the chaos beast of the deep. And into that template, generation by generation, they poured every piece of real experience that seemed to confirm and extend it. The result is that Leviathan's descriptions accumulate features from multiple real animals without precisely fitting any of them. The scales from the crocodile, the mass from the whale, the unknowability from the deep ocean itself, the fire, if it has any natural referent at all, perhaps from the phosphorescent glow that Mediterranean sailors occasionally observed on the nighttime sea, the water itself seeming to burn around the wake of something large moving just below the surface. Each feature, traced back, leads somewhere real. Together they produce something that cannot exist, which is precisely the theological point. Leviathan is not meant to be catchable. It is meant to be the measure of everything that exceeds human reach. What the ancient writers understood, even if they expressed it in the vocabulary of the sacred rather than the scientific, is that the ocean contained things larger and stranger than their categories allowed. They were right about that. The categories have changed enormously since Job was written, but the ocean has not stopped producing evidence of its own excess. The process that turned a crocodile's scales and a whale's mass and a night sea's glow into a fire-breathing, hook-defying world monster is the same process that would operate on sailors for the next 3,000 years. Observation, memory, transmission, amplification, and the persistent human need to give the unknown a body large enough to hold all the fear it generates. Leviathan is the earliest fully documented example of that process at work. It would not be the last. The process that produced Leviathan, observation compressed into myth reinforced by more observation, the whole accumulation growing denser with each generation, did not stop at the eastern Mediterranean. It moved north and west, following the routes of seafaring peoples into waters that were colder, darker, and considerably less mapped. And in those waters the monster took a different shape, not a serpent this time, not a fire-breather armoured in scales. What emerged from the North Atlantic carried a different kind of terror, the terror of something so large it did not look like a creature at all. It looked like geography. The earliest written record that scholars connect to the kraken appears in a Norwegian royal chronicle from 1180, compiled during the reign of King Sverre. The chronicle does not use the word kraken. That term would come later, crystallizing through the centuries the way monster names tend to do, as a shorthand for something that had already been accumulating in oral tradition for a long time before anyone wrote it down. What the chronicle describes instead is the Hafgufa, and the description is precise enough to be startling. The Hafgufa is characterized as more similar to an island than to any living creature, a thing of such mass that sailors who did not know better might land upon it, might mistake its broad, motionless back for a reef or a shoal, only to find themselves dragged beneath the surface when it's submerged. It has tentacles. It is associated with the seafloor. It rises. It descends. And in its wake, it pulls things down. What is immediately striking about this description is how different it is from the serpentine tradition. Leviathan and its cousins across the ancient world were elongated, sinuous, fire-associated, often explicitly serpentine. The Hafgufa, the proto-kraken, is something else. It is radial, massive, and passive in a way that makes it somehow more disturbing. A sea serpent announces itself. It comes at you. But the Hoaxes simply exists at the water's surface, vast and still, and the danger is not that it attacks, but that you do not recognize what you're standing on until the moment it ceases to hold you up. The horror is topographical. The ocean floor has risen to meet you, and then it changes its mind. This distinction matters because it tells us something about the different relationship these sailors had with the sea. The Mediterranean tradition produced monsters that were dangerous in motion, attacking ships, swallowing sailors, rising from the deep to strike. The North Atlantic tradition, rooted in Norwegian, Icelandic, and Greenlandic maritime experience, produced something that was dangerous in stillness. These were people who fished in deep, cold water, who crossed expanses of open ocean where the nearest land was days away in any direction, where fog could descend and eliminate all visual reference, and where the sea bottom dropped away to depths that no line could measure. In that environment, the most unsettling imaginable encounter would not be an attack. It would be the sudden, vertiginous realization that what you took to be solid ground was alive. The setting made this particular monster not only plausible, but in a certain light, almost inevitable. The North Atlantic waters off the Norwegian coast, along the continental shelf that drops from relatively shallow fishing grounds into oceanic depths of several hundred meters, happen to be precisely the kind of environment that Architeuthis ducks, the giant squid, inhabits. These animals, which we now know can reach lengths approaching 18 meters, live along continental shelf slopes, hunting at depths of 300 to 1,000 meters, coming closer to the surface in darkness or when following prey upward through the water column. A medieval Norwegian fisherman, working the shelf edge in the grey half-dark of an autumn afternoon, would have had no framework to understand what he was looking at if a large squid surfaced or died near his boat. The sheer physical presence of such an animal, the displacement of water, the chromatic shifts across skin that can pulse and change colour even in death, the arms arranged radially around a central mass, would have provided raw material for exactly the kind of description the Hoaxes represents. The Hoaxes is not the only entity in Norwegian tradition associated with this creature. The kraken as a named entity appears in later Scandinavian sources, described by the 18th century bishop and naturalist Erik Pontoppidan in his 1752 Natural History of Norway in terms that clearly intend a real animal, one that Pontoppidan, who collected fishermen's accounts with the methodical interest of an early naturalist, believed to be the largest marine creature in the world. He described the kraken as rising from the sea like a floating island, drawing fish to its surface with some kind of secretion or disturbance in the water, and then submerging in a way that created a whirlpool dangerous to any vessel nearby. Pontoppidan was not writing folklore. He was writing natural history, or trying to, drawing on the testimony of North Atlantic fishermen who described encounters that he took seriously enough to record. This movement, from the 1180 Chronicles Hoaxes to Pontoppidan's careful naturalist account, tracks exactly the same arc that Leviathan's tradition traces. A creature that begins in saga-like reporting, embedded in the experience of people who live and die on the water, and gradually migrates into learned discussion, into the territory where serious men of letters feel obliged to engage with it, rather than dismiss it. The kraken accomplished this migration with particular success because the people testifying to its existence were not uneducated or credulous. They were professional fishermen and sailors operating in waters they knew intimately, reporting something that did not fit what they expected to find there. It is worth pausing on what those fishermen's lives actually looked like, because the kraken story is inseparable from the particular geography of their work. Norwegian fishing communities in the medieval and early modern period were not occasional visitors to the sea. They were people for whom the North Atlantic was the primary fact of existence, the source of food, income, and death in roughly equal measure. They fished at the edge of the shelf, where the relatively familiar shallow water world dropped away into something else entirely. They encountered sperm whales which dived to extraordinary depths to feed on giant squid and occasionally surface with circular sucker scars on their skin. Physical evidence, if anyone had known how to read it, of battles fought in darkness a kilometre below the surface. They encountered occasionally the washed-up remains of animals they could not identify. Massive arms, beaks of extraordinary hardness, fragments of creatures whose total dimensions could only be guessed at from the parts that made it to shore. The kraken grew in exactly this soil. Deep familiarity with the sea, repeated encounters with evidence of something large and unknown, and the practical maritime intelligence to take those encounters seriously rather than explain them away. By the time Carolus Linnaeus compiled the first edition of his Systema Naturae in 1735, the kraken had made the full journey from saga creature to scientific candidate. Linnaeus listed it among the cephalopods, an extraordinary moment in the history of zoological classification, and one that he would quietly remove from later editions as the pressure of scientific skepticism grew. But the inclusion itself is significant. One of the most rigorous taxonomic minds of the 18th century looked at the accumulated evidence for the kraken and decided it was serious enough to classify. He was, as it turned out, more right than his contemporaries were willing to credit. The science had not yet caught up with the sailors. What the kraken's early history reveals, set against the Leviathan tradition that preceded it, is that this process of monster making is not random or culturally arbitrary. It follows the water. It grows where people spend enough time at sea to encounter the genuine unexplained, where the depths are deep enough and cold enough and dark enough to hide something real, and where the professional culture of maritime work creates both the observations and the networks through which those observations travel and accumulate. The serpent had the Mediterranean. The Leviathan had the theological tradition of the ancient Near East. The kraken had the North Atlantic, those particular latitudes of fog and shelf edge and black water, and in those waters it found more than enough evidence to sustain itself for 6 centuries before science finally descended deep enough to meet it face to face. The creature was always there. The question was only whether the instruments would ever go deep enough to confirm what the fishermen had been reporting all along. So what exactly were those fishermen seeing? The previous section traced the kraken's institutional history, the chronicles, the naturalist, the Linnaean footnote. But the creature at the centre of that history is real, and it deserves its own account. Not the legend this time, but the animal. Because once you understand what Architeuthis dux actually is, what it looks like, how it lives, and what happens when it dies, the distance between the monster and the biology collapses to something very nearly nothing. Begin with the body. The giant squid is a cephalopod, which means its anatomy is organised around a central mantle, a muscular, torpedo-shaped structure that houses its organs and drives its movement through jet propulsion. The mantle alone, in large confirmed specimens, can reach roughly 2¼ meters in length. Attached to that mantle are 8 arms, shorter and arranged radially around the mouth, and 2 feeding tentacles that are a different matter entirely. Those tentacles extend to lengths that can approach 10 meters, slender and reaching, equipped at their ends with clubs densely packed with sucker cups 2 to 5 centimeters across, each sucker ringed with sharp, serrated teeth of hardened protein. The tentacles are not simply long, they are fast, accurate, and designed for one purpose, to seize prey that would otherwise escape into the dark. The eyes are where the description threatens to leave ordinary biological language behind. Architeuthis has the largest eyes of any living animal on Earth. In mature specimens they reach 27 centimeters in diameter, roughly the size of a dinner plate. These are not metaphorically large. They are the result of an evolutionary pressure exerted by living at depth, in water where the only available light arrives in the form of bioluminescent flickers from other organisms, where detecting the faintest movement against that near-total darkness is the difference between eating and starving. An eye that large is an eye shaped by a world of almost perfect dark. When one surfaces, when a dead or wounded giant squid rolls at the surface, and those eyes catch whatever light exists, the visual impression they create does not belong to any familiar animal. It belongs to something from a taxonomy that has no category except monster. The total length of confirmed specimens reaches approximately 13 meters when the feeding tentacles are included, with most reliably measured adults falling somewhat shorter than that. This is a scientifically documented figure, constrained by actual physical measurements of washed-up carcasses, remains recovered from sperm whale stomachs, and the live footage captured by a Japanese research team in 2005, the first time anyone had ever photographed a living giant squid in its natural habitat at depth. The animal in that footage, filmed at around 900 meters below the surface in the North Pacific, was actively hunting, trailing a tentacle that had become snagged on bait attached to the camera rig. It fought for 4 hours. When it finally tore free, it left the tentacle behind, roughly 5½ meters of it, which the researchers recovered and brought to the surface. Folklore, meanwhile, was reporting animals of 30 to 60 meters, with eyes whose circumference was measured in body lengths rather than centimeters. These numbers do not reflect actual squid dimensions. They reflect the distortion that accumulates around any unknown animal that people encounter in fragments and in fear. A tentacle glimpsed at the surface and estimated against a heaving hull, a partial carcass whose true proportions are obscured by decomposition and the rolling of waves, a drawing copied and rescaled by someone who never saw the source animal and had no reason not to exaggerate. The gap between 13 meters and 60 meters is not evidence against the squid. It is evidence of how size estimation works when the object being estimated is unlike anything in the estimator's experience. The elusiveness of the giant squid is not incidental to its history as a monster. It is the precondition for everything that followed. These animals live in the deep pelagic zone, between roughly 300 and 1,000 meters, in cold water along the slopes of continental shelves and seamounts worldwide. They maintain their position in the water column partly through a buoyancy system that relies on ammonium-rich body fluids, ammonium chloride, lighter than seawater, which effectively keeps the animal neutrally buoyant without the constant muscular effort that would otherwise be required at those depths. This same chemistry means that giant squid flesh tastes strongly of ammonia, which may be one reason sperm whales, which apparently find it palatable, are otherwise almost the only animals that regularly engage with them. For centuries, virtually everything known about the giant squid was inferred from indirect evidence. The sucker scars on sperm whale skin, the beaks recovered from whale stomachs, the fragments and complete carcasses that occasionally washed ashore after storms or appeared floating at the surface when an animal had died or was dying. These strandings were the original kraken sightings. A large squid dying near the surface would be unrecognizable to anyone without specific biological knowledge. The mantle would be pale and massive, rising and falling with the swell. The arms would spread outward, trailing across the water in a radial pattern that resembles nothing else in surface-level ocean experience. The tentacles, extending to their full reach, could stretch away from the central mass to a distance that would make the whole floating assemblage look far larger than any single coherent animal ought to be. And there is the ink, a dark cloud that a wounded or dying squid releases into the water around itself, a chemical and visual signature that, in the context of a grey sea and an overcast afternoon, would read as something deeply, inexplicably wrong about the water in that particular place. Consider what a Norwegian fisherman in the 12th century would actually perceive encountering this. He would not see a squid. He had no category for a squid of this size. He would see a mass at the surface, larger than anything living things are supposed to be, surrounded by spreading darkness, with what appeared to be multiple long limbs trailing away in different directions. If it was alive, it might pulse and shift colour. Giant squid can display rapid chromatophore changes even as they are dying, the nervous system continuing to fire in patterns that produce light and dark bands rippling across the skin. If the animal then sank, as dying squid eventually do when they lose the ability to maintain position, the displacement of water as that mass descended could produce exactly the kind of localized turbulence that Pontoppidan's fisherman described as a dangerous suction in the water. Not a whirlpool in the dramatic sense, but a disturbance, a draw downward, enough, in a small open boat on a dark afternoon, to feel like the sea itself was reaching up. Match these details against the historical kraken accounts and the correspondence is not suggestive. It is overwhelming. The kraken has multiple arms. The giant squid has 10 appendages, 8 arms and 2 tentacles, arranged around a central axis. The kraken's eyes are described as large and luminous, sometimes as flaming. The giant squid has eyes 27 centimeters across that catch and reflect light in a way that nothing else in the ocean does. The kraken is described as rising from the deep and then descending, with dangerous disturbance around its disappearance. Giant squid surface when dying, then sink. The kraken is said to secrete something that draws fish to it, which some naturalists interpreted as a feeding strategy, and the ammonium-rich water that surrounds a dead squid does in fact attract scavengers. Even the kraken's island quality, its sheer mass, its apparent stability at the surface, matches the way a large squid carcass would present to someone approaching it in an open boat. Of all the animals that have been proposed as the biological reality behind the kraken tradition, oarfish, giant eels, unknown species of unknown proportion, even the occasional suggestion of surviving prehistoric marine reptiles. None fits the specific details as well as Architeuthis. The oarfish, which we will encounter later in a different context, matches the serpentine tradition better than the radial, many-armed kraken. The whale accounts describe something with a different profile. Only the giant squid brings together the right combination of features: the arms, the eyes, the depth, the surface appearances, the ink, the size, and above all the profound inaccessibility that kept it out of scientific view until a camera was lowered to 900 meters and the legend finally swam into the frame. The science arrived 6 centuries after the fisherman, but what the science found was exactly what the fishermen had been trying to describe. They did not have the vocabulary. They had instead the monster, which turned out to be a more durable container for the truth than anyone who dismissed them ever anticipated. The giant squid, then, was real. But the fishermen who encountered it had no way of knowing that. What they had instead was language, imprecise, vivid, accumulated, and eventually someone willing to put that language onto paper and give it a shape the whole world could see. That someone was a Swedish Catholic archbishop named Olaus Magnus, and what he produced in 1539 changed not just how people thought about the northern seas, but how they thought about the ocean itself. The document in question is known as the Carta Marina. It was first printed in Venice, a city that understood maps the way a banker understands ledgers, as instruments of power and commerce simultaneously. The map covered the northern world from Iceland to Finland, from Scandinavia down toward the Baltic, and it was enormous. Assembled from 9 separate woodcut sheets, the finished map measured roughly 23 square feet of wall. When you stood before it, the sea did not look like empty water. It looked like a battlefield. Every major stretch of open ocean on the Carta Marina is occupied, not by ships, or only partly by ships, primarily by things that should not exist, or rather, by things that sailors insisted did. A beast with the head of a horned cat and the coiled body of a serpent arcs over a vessel near the Norwegian coast. Something that resembles an enormous lobster, or perhaps a crab scaled to the size of a cathedral, clutches at the water near Iceland. A creature whose description Magnus would later formalize in his 1555 text, the Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus, snakes through the waters in a form so large he measured it explicitly, 200 feet long and 20 feet thick. That is roughly 60 meters in length, the equivalent of 5 city buses placed end to end, hauling themselves through the sea. These numbers were not chosen carelessly. Magnus was an educated man, a churchman with scholarly credentials and access to earlier encyclopedic traditions, including Pliny's Natural History, which had its own accounting of giant marine animals. But the monsters on the Carta Marina were not simply copied from books. They were, according to Magnus himself, drawn from the testimony of sailors, men who had navigated the Moskstraumen, the powerful tidal current off the Lofoten Islands of Norway, and the fjords and headlands where the sea behaves in ways that even experienced mariners found difficult to predict and impossible to explain. The map was a record of their accumulated dread, translated into visual form by someone with the artistic and institutional authority to make that dread official. This is what makes the Carta Marina something other than decoration. The monsters were not placed on the map to fill empty space or delight curious readers in comfortable studies. They were warnings. They marked the Norwegian coast as a place of genuine maritime danger, where the tidal forces were strong enough to overwhelm vessels, where the seafloor dropped and rose in ways that produced unpredictable currents and underwater hazards. A cartographer who placed a 200-foot serpent in a particular stretch of water was communicating something sailors already understood. Do not go there without preparation, or perhaps do not go there at all. The monster was a pictorial hazard sign, but it was also more than that. It was the shape that fear takes when fear has been described enough times to acquire a consistent outline. What Magnus had done, whether or not he fully understood it, was collapse the distance between rumour and authority. Sailors reported strange shapes in the water. Those reports circulated in oral tradition, in harbour taverns, in the letters that ship's captains occasionally wrote home. They were unverified, unstable, subject to elaboration with each retelling. But once a report passed through Magnus's hand and onto the copper plate or woodblock, it gained a different kind of weight. It was printed, it was permanent. It had a shape, and that shape had dimensions, and those dimensions were attached to a map that was rapidly accepted across Europe as the definitive image of the northern world. The Carta Marina was reprinted and distributed throughout the latter half of the 16th century, and what happened next was entirely predictable in retrospect, though no one seems to have seen it coming at the time. Later cartographers, men who had never seen the Norwegian coast, who had never spoken to a fisherman from Lofoten, who had never stood at the rail of a vessel in cold northern water, watching something they could not identify, move beneath the surface, began to copy Magnus's monsters onto their own maps. Not because they had independent evidence for them, but because the monsters were on the authoritative map, and removing them would have implied either special knowledge or special skepticism, neither of which most cartographers felt entitled to claim. The forms became standardized. The coiling serpent with its particular proportions, the multi-armed mass near Iceland, the creatures with fins and tusks and bodies that blended the recognizable features of known animals into configurations that no single known animal possessed. By the end of the 16th century, sea monsters had become a visual vocabulary, a shared iconographic language that any educated European could read without explanation, because they had seen the same shapes in map after map after map. What had begun as the uncertain testimony of individual sailors had been laundered through the printing press into something that resembled established fact. This is the feedback loop, and once you see it, it is impossible to unsee. A sailor sees something, a dying squid perhaps, or a whale in distress, or a large oarfish thrashing at the surface, and describes it in terms his language provides. His language provides sea serpent, sea orm, creature of great size and terrible aspect. That description reaches Magnus or another compiler, who translates it into an image. The image circulates in print. The next sailor who sees something odd in the water has already, before he ever set foot on a ship, looked at maps with monsters on them. His perception of the new sighting is shaped by the template he carries. He reports not what he sees raw, but what he sees filtered through the visual grammar that the printed image has installed in him. The report that comes back to shore confirms the monster. The monster that returns to the next map is slightly more specific, slightly more fixed, its dimensions and features slightly more certain, and so the creature solidifies, edition by edition, century by century, growing more definite precisely as it grows further from any particular moment of actual observation. The natural historians were not immune to this loop. If anything, they were at its centre. When Guillaume Rondelet compiled his works on marine life in the mid-16th century, he worked from testimony, from specimens when he could obtain them, and from the same illustrated encyclopedic tradition that had shaped Magnus. When Conrad Gessner included sea creatures in his Historia Animalium, he drew on sailors' accounts and on earlier images. The monsters in their pages are not identical to Magnus's monsters, but they breathe the same air. They are part of the same continuous effort to give systematic form to what was known, half known, and rumoured about the sea, and the images that resulted circulated back out into the culture, shaping what sailors thought they were seeing and what naturalists thought they were classifying. What this means is that the history of sea monsters is not simply the history of imagination. It is the history of how knowledge travels, through bodies, through talk, through images, through the authority that print confers on anything it touches. Olaus Magnus was not a fool and he was not a fraud. He was a man trying to document a world that was genuinely strange and dangerous, using the tools available to him, which included the testimony of men who had actually been out on that water and returned with something they needed to describe. The distortions that accumulated around that testimony were not his doing alone. They were the product of every hand that copied the image, every press that reprinted the map, every reader who absorbed the visual vocabulary and carried it forward. The sea orm on the Carta Marina is 200 feet long, because that is how it was measured in the text. Whether any animal of that size actually moved through Norwegian waters is a different question entirely, one that will require the rest of this story to answer. But the form of the creature, the sinuous body, the enormous length, the presence in cold northern water, those details had been circulating since long before Magnus put them on parchment. They were waiting for someone to give them the permanence of print. And once that happened, the monster no longer lived only in the water. It lived in the mind of anyone who had ever looked at a map and seen, at the edge of the charted world, the careful, terrifying shape of something that should not exist. The template was set. The serpent had dimensions, a shape, a place on the map, and then, on the 6th of July, 1734, a Danish missionary named Hans Egede stood on the deck of his ship at approximately 64 degrees north latitude, off the coast of Greenland, and saw something that fit the template almost perfectly. Egede was not a superstitious man, or at least he did not consider himself one. He was a Lutheran clergyman, methodical and observant, committed to recording what he encountered in the northern waters, with as much precision as his position and the conditions would allow. He had been operating in Greenland for over a decade, working among the Inuit population and navigating some of the most demanding waters in the North Atlantic. He was not a man given to invention, and the account he left in his journal was not written as entertainment or as legend. It was written as a report. What he described was this: a creature surfaced near the ship whose head, when raised, cleared the height of the mainmast. It had a long pointed snout. It spouted water from the top of its head as a whale does. Its skin was wrinkled and rough, with a texture he compared to scales. It had broad, flat appendages that functioned like flippers. Its lower body was serpentine, tapering toward the water, and then, as the ship moved and the creature sank, its tail, or what appeared to be its tail, broke the surface again, roughly a ship's length behind the point where the head had been. Egede's crew were not silent observers. They estimated the animal's total length at somewhere between 3 and 4 times the length of their own vessel. If the ship measured anywhere between 60 and 80 feet, a reasonable estimate for a vessel of that type and period, then the crew were looking at something between 200 and 300 feet of animal. The numbers were impossible, which did not stop them from believing them completely. This is the first thing to understand about sightings like Egede's. Eyewitness confidence and eyewitness accuracy are not the same thing. The crew of that ship were experienced men in northern waters. They had no motive to lie, no audience to impress in that moment, no literary tradition they were consciously invoking. They saw something. They measured it against the only reference point available, their own ship, and they recorded what that measurement produced. The problem is that visual estimation from the deck of a moving vessel, in breaking northern swells, with an animal that is mostly below the surface, is not a reliable instrument. The sea intervenes constantly. It obscures, fragments, and rearranges what is actually there. And this is the second thing to understand. What Egede actually described, when you strip away the size estimates and look at the individual features, is not a complete animal. It is a collection of glimpses, a head that rose, appendages that were visible for a moment, a tail that appeared after the head had already submerged. The body connecting those parts, the long middle section that the crew's imagination assembled into something 3 ship lengths across, was never actually seen. It was beneath the water. The serpentine length that Egede's account implies was not observed. It was inferred by men who already had a template for what they were looking at. Henry Lee, a 19th century naturalist who spent considerable effort examining sea serpent accounts, with the skepticism that his era's scientific culture encouraged, looked at Egede's description in 1883 and proposed something unexpected. He argued that what the crew had witnessed was not a serpent at all, but a giant squid, specifically its exposed head and a single extending tentacle. The squid's mantle breaking the surface would produce the rough, wrinkled, fleshy appearance Egede described. The tentacle trailing behind and periodically rising above the waterline would account for the tail that appeared a ship's length from the head. The flappers Egede mentioned are consistent with the lateral fins that run along the mantle of a large squid. The spouting he attributed to whale-like behaviour might have been water expelled through the siphon, which is precisely how a squid breathes and propels itself. The head and the tentacle, Lee argued, were the only parts ever genuinely visible. Everything else, the vast connecting body, the serpentine coil, the total length that dwarfed the ship, was projected by witnesses onto the surface of the water, assembled from pieces by minds that were working from a script they had absorbed long before they ever went to sea. What Egede saw was probably 20 feet of squid anatomy, broken across the waves into something that looked, through the salt spray and the motion of the ship, like the head and tail of a creature 300 feet long. This matters because it illuminates something fundamental about how the classic sea serpent sighting actually works. The pattern repeats across centuries and across oceans with remarkable consistency. A head or leading body section visible at one point, a trailing section visible at another point, and a gap in between that the witness fills with continuity. The humps that appear in so many accounts, The rows of rounded masses moving in sequence across the water are particularly revealing. A pod of dolphins or porpoises swimming in formation, each surfacing and diving in sequence, produces exactly this visual, a series of rising and falling shapes that, from a distance and at the wrong angle, looks less like a school of animals and more like a single enormous body undulating through the water. The rhythmic rise and fall that Egede and countless others described is the natural motion of the sea itself, imposed on whatever is actually present. The mane-like crest that appears in other accounts, the rough ridge along the back of the creature that several observers specifically remarked upon, is consistent with the fin of a large oarfish, a creature that carries a bright red dorsal fin running the full length of its body, an animal that can reach 15 or 20 feet in length, and that moves in the upper water column in ways that are deeply strange to observe. It is also consistent with a decomposing whale, whose blubber layer separates from the muscle beneath as it breaks down, creating loose, flowing tissue that resembles a mane in motion. What was seen as decorative anatomy may have been material evidence of death. The irony in all of this is that the witnesses were not wrong to be startled. They were encountering genuinely extraordinary animals in extraordinary conditions. A giant squid at the surface is not a mundane event. An oarfish moving through grey northern swells is not something a sailor sees and dismisses. The instinct to describe these encounters in the most expansive terms available was not dishonesty. It was the only language the situation seemed to warrant. The sea had produced something that exceeded ordinary categories, and the witnesses reached for the category that could contain it. But the category they reached for was already shaped. The serpent with its humps and coils and mane had been on the maps for 200 years by the time Egede wrote his account. It had been in the natural histories, in the travellers' tales, in the harbour conversations that preceded every voyage north. When something large and unfamiliar surfaced near the ship and then slipped back beneath the water, the mind did not face that object naked. It faced it armed with an existing shape, and it fitted what it saw to the shape it already knew. Egede's original Danish diary has not survived. What remains are translations and copies, and they differ from each other in small but telling ways. Different word choices, slightly different measurements, varying degrees of certainty in the language around what the crew believed they had seen. This is the condition of most historical sea serpent accounts. The original, immediate record is inaccessible, and what we work from is already mediated, already passed through at least one additional mind before it reaches us. The certainty that the eyewitnesses felt, and they were certain, the accounts make this clear, has been worn smooth by transmission, and what is left is an outline rather than a document. That outline, though, is precise enough to work with. Head above the mast, pointed snout, flipper-like appendages, wrinkled skin, a tail appearing where no tail should be, separated from the head by empty water. A vast inferred body connecting details that were never simultaneously visible. This is what a sea serpent looks like when you examine it carefully. Not a creature, but a pattern of perception. Not a single animal, but the negative space between glimpses, filled in by every image, every map, every account that had prepared the witness to see exactly what he reported. The water between the head and the tail was never empty. Something was there. The question that would take another 2 centuries to begin answering was what, exactly, that something was. So the question stands, what was actually in the water? Not the inferred body, not the assembled template, not the projection of 2 centuries of accumulated imagery, but the actual animal, or animals, or objects that produced these reports with such consistency across so many oceans and so many centuries of seafaring. The answer, it turns out, is not a single answer. It is a catalogue. Start with the oarfish. Reglecus gleason is the world's longest bony fish, and it earns that distinction in a way that is difficult to appreciate until you see one. Verified specimens have reached 30 feet, and credible estimates suggest individuals may grow longer still. The body is narrow and lateral, almost ribbon-like, not a round tube of muscle like a conger eel, but a flat silver blade that catches the light differently depending on the angle. Running the full length of its back is a dorsal fin of vivid, almost improbable red, the colour of arterial blood, rising in individual rays that flutter in the current like a crest or a mane. The head carries additional filaments above the eyes. From a distance in motion, it does not look like a fish. It does not look like anything in the categories a sailor would have been working with. What makes the oarfish particularly relevant to the sea serpent question is not just its size, but its behaviour at the surface. These are deep water animals that spend most of their lives well below the photic zone, but they periodically appear in shallow water, and when they do, they often swim vertically, oriented not horizontally in the water column as most fish swim, but upright, like a living knife, with the head at the surface and the body descending straight below. A vertical oarfish at the surface, seen from the deck of a ship, presents a head with a fleshy crest and a thin, shimmering body descending into the sea with no visible end. Its length is implied rather than observed. Its red dorsal fin matches with remarkable fidelity the mane or crest that appears in account after account after account. When it moves, the body undulates in a way that is hypnotic and strange, producing the kind of rhythmic serpentine motion that witnesses consistently described. It is also almost never seen alive by anyone other than deep-sea researchers, which means that when a surface encounter does occur, the witness has no frame of reference, no prior sighting to draw on, nothing to anchor the experience in the familiar. The oarfish offers the sea its closest approximation to a genuine monster. But the oarfish does not account for everything. The Gloucester sightings of the early 19th century, which attracted hundreds of witnesses along the New England coast over several decades, described something with a particular quality, a series of rounded humps, evenly spaced, moving together through the harbour in coordinated sequence. That profile does not match a single large fish or a single large squid. It matches something else entirely. R.L. France, writing in the International Journal of Maritime History in 2016, proposed a reinterpretation of these and related sightings that is both precise and persuasive. What the Gloucester witnesses were watching, he argued, was not a serpent but a whale, or more precisely a whale in distress, entangled in the fishing gear that was already a feature of those waters by that period. A large whale caught in nets or ropes, and struggling at the surface, moves in a way that is entirely unlike the calm, rhythmic dive-and-surface pattern of a healthy cetacean. It twists, it rolls, it forces sections of its body above the waterline in irregular, effortful surges. When multiple whales are moving in loose formation, or when a single large animal is partially visible through floating debris, the impression from a distance is precisely the alternating series of rounded masses that witnesses described. The humps appearing and disappearing in sequence, the body moving with an undulating rhythm that seems too regular to be several separate animals, but too segmented to be one smooth creature. The fishing gear that entangled these animals was itself significant, rope and net floating at the surface attached to a struggling animal, and arrayed behind it in a long trailing mass, could extend the apparent length of the creature by hundreds of yards, producing observations of something genuinely serpentine in scale, even when the animal at the centre of the scene was a perfectly ordinary, if deeply unfortunate, humpback or sperm whale. Then there are the carcasses. In 1977, a Japanese fishing vessel called the Zuyomaru hauled up a decomposing carcass from deep water off New Zealand. It was large, roughly 30 feet, and it had a long, thin neck, 4 broad limb-like appendages, and a body shape that photographs suggested was nothing like any modern fish or whale. For a brief and heady period, the scientific community entertained the possibility that a living plesiosaur had been found. Tissue samples were taken, measurements were recorded, the photographs circulated internationally, and the creature was named prematurely New Nessie. Chemical analysis ultimately resolved the question. The animal was a basking shark. But the resolution reveals something important about how these misidentifications occur. A basking shark in advanced decomposition is one of the most reliably misleading objects in the ocean. The dorsal and caudal fins fall away early in the decaying process, leaving a long, smooth torso. The large gill arches and jaw structure collapse and separate, producing what appears to be a distinct elongated neck and a small head. The remaining tissue takes on a fibrous, tendon-like quality that does not look like the blubbery bulk of a whale or the scaled exterior of a familiar fish. It looks, in a word, prehistoric. A similar carcass washed ashore in Massachusetts in 1970, 30 feet long, 11 tons, unmistakably monstrous in appearance to anyone encountering it without prior knowledge. That one was identified as a basking shark too, but not before it had circulated in local memory as evidence that something was out there. Then there is simple debris. Floating timber, masses of kelp tangled into irregular shapes, overturned boats in the aftermath of storms, clusters of buoyant objects caught in current together. None of these are animals, but all of them can occupy the same perceptual space as an animal when observed from a moving deck in imperfect conditions. A 2023 analysis of Norwegian fjord sightings proposed that some of the most dramatic historical accounts involved harpooned sperm whales held fast to overturned rowboats. The combination of the dying animal and the wreckage spreading across hundreds of yards of surface, producing at a distance the impression of a single massive segmented, slowly moving form. The men who reported these things were not imagining them. They were reading the surface of the sea as best they could, in conditions that made accurate reading exceptionally difficult, and they were producing in good faith descriptions that fit the template they had already been given. None of this entirely resolves the record. There are sightings that resist comfortable assignment to any of these categories, accounts detailed enough and internally consistent enough to leave the oarfish and the basking shark sitting slightly out of reach as complete explanations. The sea is large, and biological surveys of its deepest and most remote regions remain strikingly incomplete. The giant squid was treated as legend for centuries and turned out to be real. The colossal squid, larger still, was known only from partial remains until recently. The oarfish still yields surprises. A 2023 deep-sea video captured one moving through the water column in ways that researchers found genuinely unexpected. The honest position is not that all sea serpent sightings have been explained, but that the ones which have been examined carefully tend to yield a natural candidate, sometimes a single strong one, sometimes several plausible ones competing, and that the gap between the reported creature and the actual one is consistently filled by the same mechanism, a mind in possession of a template, encountering something it cannot immediately identify, and doing what minds do. The sea offered real animals strange enough to justify the reporting. It offered conditions that could not be controlled for, and it offered observers who were genuinely trying to describe what they saw, working with the vocabulary and the categories that their world had given them. The monsters were real, in the sense that something was always there. What accumulated around that something, the size, the malevolence, the serpentine coil stretching across the horizon, that was the contribution of everyone who had told the story before them, shaping the empty water into a form that the next witness would be ready to recognize. But the story of sea monsters does not belong entirely to the open ocean and the men trying to read it honestly. By the middle of the 19th century, a different kind of sea monster had emerged, one that lived not in the Atlantic or the Norwegian fjords, but in exhibition halls, newspaper advertisements, and the carefully managed wonder of the paying public. This creature was not misidentified. It was manufactured. And its history says something important about how the line between genuine curiosity and deliberate fabrication became, for a time, almost impossible to locate. The Victorian appetite for marvels was not a weakness of credulous minds. It was a cultural condition with a specific economic shape. By the 1840s, the natural world was being systematically gathered and displayed for the first time on anything like a mass scale. Museums were opening in industrial cities. Lecture halls filled for evenings on natural philosophy. Newspapers ran illustrations of excavated bones from American river valleys and European limestone quarries, creatures that had never been seen alive by anyone, enormous and strange and confirmed real by the weight of scientific authority. This was the age in which the ancient and the extraordinary became, for ordinary people, suddenly accessible, not through travel or expedition, but through the exhibit hall, the handbill, the illustrated weekly. The public had developed a hunger for contact with the genuinely astonishing, and where genuine astonishment fell short, the showmen were ready to fill the gap. Albert Koch understood this hunger as well as anyone alive. He had already made his reputation, and a serviceable fortune, through a museum he opened in St. Louis in 1836, where he displayed mastodon bones alongside stranger, more ambiguous specimens, mixing legitimate paleontological finds with exhibits that were, to put it charitably, imaginatively presented. The museum-going public of that era occupied an interesting epistemic position. They could not always distinguish a real fossil from a fabricated assemblage, because the science that would allow them to do so was still being developed in the same moment. Koch exploited that gap with remarkable ingenuity, and when he set his sights on a sea monster, he did so with the full weight of that experience behind him. What Koch built in 1845 and exhibited under the name Hydrarchus was, by any honest accounting, one of the most audacious frauds in the history of natural history. He had acquired fossil remains of Basilosaurus, an extinct ancient whale known then as Zeuglodon, and assembled them not as a single animal, but as a composite drawn from several individuals, their bones arranged end-to-end to produce a skeleton of extraordinary length. The final structure was advertised at 114 feet. Some of Koch's promotional materials pushed the figure to 140. Either way, it was presented as a genuine prehistoric sea serpent, a Leviathan made literal in bone, proof that the creatures of sailors' nightmares had once been entirely real and might, by implication, still be lurking somewhere beneath the surface of the deep. Koch charged the public 25 cents in New York, a shilling in London, to stand in its shadow and feel the particular thrill of confirmed belief. The crowds came. They came in numbers that validated every calculation Koch had made about the market for marvels, and the experience was not entirely empty. There were real fossils in that hall, real bones from a real animal that had genuinely lived in ancient seas and genuinely been enormous. Koch had simply assembled them dishonestly, extending the body well beyond any single creature's actual dimensions, fabricating the suggestion of a serpentine form rather than the compact whale-like body that Basilosaurus actually possessed. The science was manipulated, but the wonder it triggered was genuine, and that combination, real material, false arrangement, authentic emotional response, was exactly what made the Victorian exhibition industry so difficult to disentangle from legitimate inquiry. Not everyone was taken in. Charles Lyell, by 1845 one of the most respected geologists in the English-speaking world, encountered the Hydrarchus advertisement, inspected the exhibit, and stated publicly that it was a hoax, that the skeleton was composite, the dimensions fraudulent, and the monster narrative a commercial fiction. Lyell's dismissal was unambiguous and well-reasoned, and it made essentially no difference to the exhibit's commercial success. The public that paid to see the Hydrarchus was not, in most cases, seeking scientific validation. They were seeking the experience of proximity to something extraordinary, and Koch had provided that experience whether the skeleton was honest or not. What Lyell's intervention reveals is not scientific failure, but a deeper truth about how these exhibitions functioned. The authority of science could be invoked to build the spectacle, but the same authority struggled to dismantle it once the crowd was already in the room. P.T. Barnum had arrived at an identical conclusion 3 years earlier, when his American museum in New York displayed what he called the Fiji mermaid, a disturbing object consisting of a monkey's upper body, dried and carefully joined to the rear portion of a large fish, then presented as a genuine specimen retrieved from Pacific waters. Barnum promoted it with 10,000 pamphlets and a newspaper campaign that established the mermaid as an object of scientific controversy before anyone had actually seen it, so that by the time the exhibit opened, the public arrived already arguing about its authenticity rather than questioning whether the controversy was real. He leased the specimen for $12.50 a week and turned it into one of the most profitable attractions his museum had ever run. The Fiji mermaid was, in one sense, a straightforward deception. In another, it was a remarkably sophisticated study in the mechanics of wonder, how to generate it, sustain it, and monetize it before the mechanics were examined too closely. What Koch and Barnum shared was not simply dishonesty, but a particular insight into the relationship between the public and the natural world at that historical moment. People wanted the monsters to be real. They had centuries of narrative telling them that the sea contained things beyond ordinary comprehension, that the deep harboured forms life had not yet catalogued, that the edges of what was known were close enough to touch if you could only find the right specimen. The museums and the showmen offered a version of that contact, curated, controlled, commercially managed, and the fact that the contact was fraudulent mattered less than the fact that it was available. You could stand 12 inches from the bones of a sea serpent for 25 cents. The price of admission was also the price of belief. The damage this caused to the broader project of understanding sea monsters was real and lasting. Every Koch exhibit, every Barnum attraction, every fabricated marvel that made the newspapers and then the retraction columns added a layer of contamination to the record. Genuine eyewitness accounts of unusual animals began to circulate in a cultural space already saturated with known frauds. Scientists who might otherwise have engaged seriously with unusual sightings pulled back, unwilling to be associated with the exhibition circuit and its habits. The signal and the noise became increasingly difficult to separate, and the rational response to a new sea serpent report, whether from a credible naval officer or a merchant captain of good reputation, was shaped, unavoidably, by the memory of the Hydrarchos and whatever came after it. And yet the same contamination that damaged the record also preserved something important. The hoaxes kept the monsters in public conversation during precisely the decades when genuine scientific tools for investigating them were being developed. The Hydrarchos was a fraud, but it drew enormous crowds to a hall where they stood next to the actual bones of an ancient whale and wondered for the first time what had lived in the prehistoric sea. That wonder did not evaporate when the fraud was exposed. It redirected. The people who had stood in Coke's Hall were better prepared than they would otherwise have been to follow the debates about giant squid, about oarfish, about the biology of deep-water animals that began accumulating serious evidence in the second half of the century. Natural history collecting in this period was genuinely inseparable from the culture of display. The same institutions that commissioned voyages of collection also mounted exhibitions for the paying public. The same scientists who argued in journals about the classification of cephalopods wrote popular accounts for illustrated magazines. The line between the cabinet of curiosities and the scientific collection was not a sharp one. It had been drawn incrementally, and the showmen had watched it being drawn and positioned themselves on both sides of it simultaneously. What the Hydrarchos episode demonstrates, beneath the fraud and the profit, is that the monster had become an institution, something maintained not just by sailors at sea, but by the entire apparatus of Victorian popular science, in all its ambition, its cupidity, and its genuine, if sometimes misdirected, fascination with the depths. There is a particular irony buried in the history of the kraken, not in the sailors who reported it, not in the cartographers who drew it, but in the man who gave the natural world its first systematic order and chose, deliberately, to include it. Carl Linnaeus was not a credulous man. He was, by the standards of 1735, one of the most rigorous minds working in natural philosophy, a Swedish botanist whose Systema Naturae represented an entirely new ambition, to classify every living thing on earth according to a single consistent logic, organized by observable characteristics stripped of allegory and folklore, disciplined into Latin and genus and species. This was science asserting that nature could be understood from evidence, not inherited from story, and in the same volume, in a section titled Animalia Paradoxa, Animals of Paradox, Linnaeus listed the kraken. He kept company there with the hydra, the unicorn, and the satyr. These were creatures drawn from report and legend, placed at the margins of the new taxonomy not as confirmed species, but as unresolved questions, entries that the system could not yet answer and was not quite willing to dismiss. The inclusion was not a failure of Linnaeus's intellectual rigour. It was, in fact, evidence of how rigour actually operated in the early 18th century, when the boundary between empirical report and inherited text was not a wall but a shoreline, something that shifted with the tide. Linnaeus was working in a period when the authority of testimony still carried enormous weight in natural philosophy. An account written by a bishop, a naval captain, or a credentialed physician was evidence in a way that required active work to dismiss. The kraken had been reported by people whose word in other contexts would not have been questioned. Bishop Erik Pontoppidan had dedicated careful pages of his Natural History of Norway to the creature, describing its dimensions, its behaviour, the disturbance it caused at the surface. Hans Egede, whose 1734 Greenland sighting appeared in the previous century's monster conversation, had added his own observations. These were not anonymous sailors shouting into storm-dark water. These were men whose professional identities rested on accurate description, and Linnaeus, cataloguing the world's creatures from his desk in Uppsala, had no physical specimen that would settle the question either way. By the 6th edition of Systema Naturae in 1748, the Paradoxa section had been quietly retired. The hydra and the unicorn disappeared from the margins of legitimate taxonomy. But the kraken did not vanish entirely. In a Swedish marginal note added to the entry for Microcosmos, a classification then applied to what appeared to be a strange free-floating marine organism, the common name kraken was preserved. It was not a formal binomial. It carried none of the taxonomic weight that a proper Latin species designation would confer. But it was there, written into the system, connecting a vernacular name heavy with centuries of Norwegian sailor testimony to the emerging architecture of scientific nomenclature. The monster had been invited in through the front door, and when the guest list was revised it remained in the building under a different name. What Linnaeus did with the microcosmos entry reveals something important about how early naturalists actually operated. He cited Thomas Bartholin's account of the Hafgufa, the Norse sea creature whose description overlapped significantly with the kraken, and Christian Franz Paulini's work on monstrous marine forms. These sources sat in a chain that ran from medieval Icelandic saga through Danish medical scholarship through early modern natural philosophy. Linnaeus was not collecting specimens from the sea floor. He was reading, synthesizing, and attempting to locate in the existing literature whatever partial truths might anchor a legend to biology. The practice was not unreasonable given his tools. It was, in many respects, the only available method. Marine zoology in 1748 could not send a research vessel to the Norwegian Trench and return with an intact specimen of whatever lived there. It could read carefully, compare accounts, and place a provisional marker where the evidence was insufficient but the pattern was suggestive. This is how the naturalists of the 18th century worked across the board. They received dried specimens, mishandled and distorted in transit. They interviewed sailors through intermediaries, in translation, across considerable distances of time and professional culture. They inherited texts that blended Aristotle with the Bible, with Renaissance hearsay, and they attempted to separate the strands through internal consistency and comparison with what physical evidence they could gather. Hans Egede, reporting on a possible juvenile kraken that had washed ashore, hypothesized its anatomy with the information available to him and arrived at something between a giant octopus, a crab, and a starfish. A composite creature assembled from a partial body and an incomplete conceptual vocabulary for what very large cephalopods might look like. He was wrong in his particulars and not unreasonable in his method. As the 19th century advanced and marine zoology acquired better tools, dredging equipment, preserved specimens, eventually the systematic collection voyages of ships like HMS Challenger, the category of the unclassifiable shrank steadily. The Animalia Paradoxa box was gone, and the spirit that had animated it was gradually replaced by stricter standards of evidence. To receive scientific attention, a creature needed a physical specimen, preferably multiple, ideally examined by several qualified observers who could agree on its basic anatomy. The kraken could not provide that, and so the name drifted out of formal taxonomy and into the vernacular, a common name, applied loosely to stories and sightings, attached provisionally to the idea of something very large in the deep water of the North Atlantic. But the name did not disappear, and when the specimens eventually arrived, when giant squid began washing ashore in Newfoundland in the 1870s, when Scandinavian fishermen recovered fragments of enormous tentacled animals, when the genus Architeuthis was formally described by the Danish zoologist Peter Steenstrup in 1857, the kraken was waiting. The creature that science formally named and classified was immediately and universally identified with the creature the sailors had been reporting for 7 centuries. The name reasserted itself not as a scientific designation, but as a cultural anchor, the word that connected the new specimen in the museum jar to the old entry in Linnaeus's margin, and the older entry still in Bishop Pontoppidan's careful pages. Science did not erase the monster. It inherited the name and changed what the name meant. This is a pattern that repeats itself across natural history, wherever the monstrous and the biological have intersected. The Leviathan became a whale, or a crocodile, or something in between, depending on which passage you were reading and which animal the translator had most recently seen. The sea serpent became an oarfish, a misread ribbon of distended whale gut, a surviving length of decomposed basking shark trailing its cartilaginous spine through cold Atlantic water. In each case, the name survived the explanation. The category persisted even when its contents were entirely revised. What this reveals is that the vocabulary of monsters was never simply a vocabulary of ignorance. It was a vocabulary of encounter, a set of names that people used to mark the boundary between the familiar and the inexplicable, to record that something had happened at sea that exceeded the available categories of biology and demanded some kind of response. When science arrived with better categories, the names often came along, because the names carried with them the entire weight of accumulated testimony, the centuries of sailors and bishops and naturalists who had stood at the edge of what they could explain and written something down. Discarding the names entirely would have meant discarding that record. Preserving them, while changing their referent, allowed science to claim continuity with the history of observation that had preceded it, however imperfect, however contaminated by the same hoaxes and frauds and well-meaning misidentifications that had complicated the record throughout. The kraken's journey from a Norwegian royal chronicle in the 1180 to Linnaeus's margin in 1748 to Steenstrup's genus in 1857 to an ROV camera in the Pacific in 2005 is not a story of superstition gradually overcome by reason. It is a story of a name doing persistent work across 7 centuries, holding open a space in human knowledge for something that was genuinely there, in the deep water, waiting to be found. The monster kept the question alive, and the science, when it finally arrived at the answer, found that the question had been pointed imprecisely but unmistakably in the right direction all along. The question had been pointed in the right direction, but pointing and seeing are different things, and for all the progress that Steenstrup's taxonomy and the Newfoundland strandings had made, there remained one gap that no amount of careful morphology could close. No one had ever watched a living giant squid move through its own world. Every specimen that science had examined had arrived already dead, battered by waves, half dissolved by the chemistry of its own tissues, dragged into contexts it had never chosen. The anatomy was coming into focus. The behaviour was still entirely imagined. For more than a century after Architeuthis received its formal name, this was simply accepted as a condition of working on deep-sea creatures. The animals lived at depths that no net could reliably reach, and no diver could survive, in cold and pressure that collapsed the tools available to Victorian and Edwardian marine biology. Researchers made do with what washed up. They measured tentacle length and mantle diameter. They examined suckers under glass and compared the accounts of sperm whalers who had watched the surface of the ocean erupt with something enormous during a night hunt. They built a portrait of the animal from its margins, always working inward toward a centre they could not directly observe. The centre finally became visible in September 2004 in the Pacific Ocean, roughly 1,000 kilometers south of Tokyo. Japanese researchers Tsunemi Kubodera and Kyoichi Mori had spent years developing a method to reach the squid's actual habitat. The approach was, in retrospect, elegant in its simplicity: bait, patience, and a camera attached to an ROV deployed at depth. They lowered the rig to approximately 900 meters in the waters off the Ogasawara Islands, a remote archipelago in the northwest Pacific where sperm whales were known to feed, which meant that something the whales were hunting was present at that depth. The camera ran, the bait waited, and after some hours a giant squid arrived. What the footage showed, stills published the following year, video released subsequently, was not the languid drifter that some researchers had imagined, a passive animal waiting for food to fall toward it from the surface. The squid moved. It struck the bait with its tentacles actively extended, and in doing so it provided, for the first time, direct visual evidence of how the animal hunted. The individual captured on camera was approximately 8 meters long. The researchers recovered several hundred images across the encounter, and a segment of tentacle was retrieved when the squid disengaged from the bait line. Fresh tissue, analyzable in ways that stranded specimens never were. The footage was published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B in 2005, and its reception was not merely scientific. It was, in the fullest sense, a cultural event. Here was the animal whose outline had been filling the margins of Norwegian chronicles since the 12th century, whose approximate dimensions had been speculated over in every generation since Pontoppidan sat down to write his natural history of Norway, whose existence had been technically confirmed by Steenstrup but never made visually real. And it was moving, hunting, existing on its own terms in its own darkness, 3/4 of a kilometre below the surface of the Pacific. The significance of visual confirmation after centuries of hearsay is easy to underestimate if you have grown up in an era of documentary film and underwater robotics. But consider what had actually been available before that footage existed. There were stranded carcasses in varying states of decomposition. There were sucker scars on the skin of sperm whales that could be measured but not witnessed forming. There were sailors' accounts filtered through skepticism, translation, and the distorting lens of 1,000 years of accumulated monster mythology. There was a set of taxonomic descriptions built from incomplete bodies and a handful of museum jars. All of that evidence was real, and all of it taken together had been sufficient to confirm that Architeuthis was a genuine species. But it had never been sufficient to show the animal as it actually was. The footage closed that gap in a way that no amount of anatomical measurement could. It also changed what the historic accounts could mean. When Kubadera and Maury's images were placed next to Bishop Pontoppidan's 18th century descriptions, or next to the accounts of whalers who had reported tentacled masses erupting at the surface during sperm whale attacks, those old records suddenly read differently. Not as exaggerations, not as honest misidentifications of something more mundane, but as imperfect descriptions of something that had genuinely been there. The sailors had not been wrong about the scale. They had not been wrong about the tentacles or the darkness, or the sense that what they were encountering operated by rules entirely foreign to anything on the surface world. They had simply lacked the vocabulary and the optics to describe it with precision. Subsequent years brought further instruments to bear. In 2013, a global genetics study analysed mitochondrial DNA from 43 giant squid specimens held in museum collections across the world. Animals that had washed ashore or been recovered as bycatch from Iceland to New Zealand, from the South Atlantic to the coasts of Japan. The analysis revealed something unexpected. Despite the immense geographic range represented by those specimens, the genetic variation between them was remarkably small. Architeuthis, it appeared, constituted a single global population, one species, one gene pool, moving through all the world's deep oceans in a life cycle that connected the North Atlantic to the Southern Ocean to the Pacific without meaningful genetic separation. The animal that the Norse sailors had reported off Scandinavia and the animal glimpsed in the deep water south of Japan were, in all meaningful biological terms, the same creature. This finding reframed the entire history of sightings. The kraken had not been a local monster, a peculiarity of Norwegian waters generated by some specific northern condition. It was everywhere the deep ocean went. Every maritime culture that had spent time on open water had been sailing above the same animal, and the reports that emerged from those cultures, Norse, Portuguese, Japanese, English, were different names for the same presence. Noah continued the work of direct observation. In 2019, a research expedition using a camera system called Medusa, which deployed red light invisible to deep-sea creatures, filmed a juvenile giant squid approaching an electronic jellyfish lure in the Gulf of Mexico. The individual was between 3 and 4 meters long, a young animal, not yet near adult size, and it came in from the darkness with a directness and apparent curiosity that no stranded specimen could have suggested. The footage was the first live giant squid ever recorded in American waters, and it demonstrated that ROV technology had reached a level of sophistication where genuine real-time encounters in the deep ocean were no longer extraordinary events, but repeatable methodology. Then, in July 2023, something ancient-looking rose toward the surface off the coast of Taiwan and was filmed by divers before it descended again. It was an oarfish, Regalicus glesson, the longest bony fish alive, a species capable of reaching lengths of 8 meters or more, its body a silver ribbon with a scarlet dorsal fin running its entire length, its face fringed with trailing pelvic fins that give it, in water, the precise appearance of a serpent with a mane. Oarfish live at depths of around 1 kilometer. They are essentially never seen in shallow water while alive. When they surface, they are usually dying or already dead, and a dying oarfish lying at the surface of the sea, long, serpentine, shimmering, impossibly large by the standards of any fish a sailor might recognize, is precisely what a sea serpent sighting looks like from a ship's rail or a small boat. The 2023 footage showed one that was alive and moving, and watching it in motion made the centuries of sea serpent reports feel newly legible. Here was the animal behind the accounts. Here was what Hans Egede might have seen crossing the Davis Strait in 1734 if the light had been better and the distance shorter. Here was what the Roman natural historians had described off the coast of the Levant, what Olaus Magnus had drawn in exaggerated but directionally accurate detail on the Carta Marina. The oarfish had not appeared for the first time in 2023. It had always been there, surfacing occasionally into the visible world and then sinking back into the dark, leaving behind a report that no taxonomy of the time could accommodate. What the deep sea had done, across all the centuries between the first Kraken account and the 2023 Taiwan footage, was remain patient. The creatures that had generated the legends had never stopped existing. They had continued their lives at depth, in cold and darkness, moving along patterns of current and prey that had nothing to do with the accumulated mythology building up above them on the surface. They had no awareness of the chronicles being written in their name, the maps being illustrated with their approximate shapes, the arguments being conducted in learned societies about whether they were real. They simply lived. The technology that finally reached them, the ROVs, the baited camera rigs, the submersible lights calibrated to wavelengths that deep-sea eyes cannot detect, the DNA sequences that could read identity from museum specimens decades after the animal had died, did not discover new creatures. It found the old ones. It provided, after centuries of inference, the direct view that every careful observer from Pontoppidan to Steenstrup had been working toward without the instruments to complete the journey. The deep sea had not been hiding. The problem had always been that humans, confined to the surface, had been unable to look. So the old ones were always there. The giant squid hunting at 900 meters, the oarfish ascending from the dark in a silver ribbon of motion, the creatures that had provoked the reports, filled the margins of the maps, and kept whole traditions of storytelling alive across 1,000 years of maritime culture. They had simply been living their lives, indifferent to the mythology accumulating above them. But that raises a question that the biology alone cannot answer. The giant squid was confirmed as a real species by the middle of the 19th century. The oarfish had been formally described even earlier. Yet the kraken did not retire from the imagination when Steenstrup filed his taxonomy. The sea serpent did not fade when scientists offered oarfish and decomposing basking sharks as explanations. Leviathan did not diminish when comparative anatomy proposed crocodiles, and then whales, and then mosasaurs as its probable origins. These monsters survived their own debunking, and they did so not by accident, but because the relationship between the myth and the real animal was never one of simple substitution. The myth had always been doing something that the scientific name alone could not do. To understand why they lasted, you have to go back further than any specific sighting. The archetype is older than the sightings themselves. Long before any Norse sailor named the kraken in a Norwegian chronicle, the same essential figure was present in the literature of cultures that had never met. Tiamat, the chaos dragon of Babylonian cosmology, was slain to make the world. Lotan, the twisted serpent of Ugaritic myth, battled the gods in the deep water. Jörmungandr, the world-encircling serpent of Norse tradition, waited at the edge of the known ocean with its tail in its own mouth. Leviathan coiled through the poetry of Job and the Psalms, described in language so dense with physical detail, fire-breathing, scale-covered, impervious to weapons at home in the abyss, that it read, to every generation that encountered it, like something the writer had actually seen rather than imagined. These traditions did not influence one another in any simple, traceable way. They emerged from geographically separated cultures across thousands of years of independent development, and yet they kept arriving at the same shape. A creature that was enormous, serpentine or tentacled, associated with deep water, and defined above all by its relationship to chaos and the unknown. That convergence is not coincidence. It is the imprint of something real pressing repeatedly against the boundaries of human experience. Sailors from every tradition had encountered the ocean's edge, had watched the water move in ways that suggested the presence of something large below the surface, had returned with reports that their cultures then shaped into narrative. The archetype survived because the ocean kept producing experiences that needed it, and then the writers got hold of it. This is where the persistence becomes self-reinforcing in a different way. By 1830, Alfred Tennyson had written a poem simply called The Kraken, an extended meditation on a creature sleeping in the deep, surrounded by darkness and slow biological process, waiting for the world's end before it surfaces for the last time. It is a poem of genuine strangeness and melancholy, and it appeared decades before the first scientifically credible giant squid specimens began arriving on European shores. Tennyson was writing the mythology, not the biology, but the mythology had absorbed enough accumulated detail from Norwegian chronicles and sailors' accounts to carry real imaginative weight. The poem made the kraken feel ancient in a way that a taxonomic entry in Linnaeus could not, because it gave the creature not just a body but an interior life, a patience, a relationship to time that made the ocean itself feel different. Victor Hugo followed in 1866 with Les Travailleurs de la Mer, in which a protagonist wrestles a poulpe, a giant octopus, in a scene of visceral and genuinely terrifying detail. Jules Verne came 4 years later with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and the giant squid attack on the Nautilus fixed the image of a tentacled deep-sea monster in the minds of every literate person in Europe and North America with access to a library. These were not frivolous entertainments built on nothing. Hugo and Verne were writing in the same decades when real squid specimens were being recovered from the beaches of Newfoundland, when the debate about the giant cephalopod's existence was at its most scientifically active. The fiction and the science were feeding the same cultural conversation, and each was making the other more vivid. The pattern repeated itself in the 20th century, but at greater scale and with the addition of new media. Cinema discovered the sea monster early and never let it go. The kraken appeared on screen in forms that range from the mythologically precise to the openly fantastical. Video games built entire oceanic mythologies around the same figures. The kraken as a boss to be defeated, Leviathan as an environmental threat, the sea serpent as a hazard on open water maps, reaching audiences for whom the original Norse chronicles or the Book of Job were entirely unfamiliar, but who absorbed the essential shape of the monster nonetheless. Television gave these creatures new adaptations in each generation. Every time the image was revised for a new medium or a new audience, it pulled in fresh details from whatever the science had most recently discovered, while retaining the emotional core that the archetype had always carried. The deep water is not empty, and what lives there does not follow the rules of the surface world. This is not mere nostalgia or cultural inertia. It reflects something that remains genuinely true. For all that technology has accomplished in the past 2 decades, the ROV footage, the DNA analysis, the calibrated deep-sea cameras that finally brought the giant squid into view, the ocean is still, in any meaningful operational sense, largely unknown. More than 80% of the world's seafloor has not been mapped in high resolution. Creatures are still being described as new species from the deep ocean every year. The conditions that exist below 500 meters, the cold, the pressure, the permanent absence of light, remain hostile to sustained human observation in ways that no other environment on the planet matches. When the 2005 footage of the living giant squid was released, it was not experienced as the mundane confirmation of a known fact. It was received by scientists and the general public alike as a genuine revelation, as though the distance between knowing something exists and actually seeing it move through its own world turned out to be vast in ways that no one had quite anticipated. That gap, between knowing and seeing, between formal confirmation and direct witness, is exactly where the monsters have always lived. The kraken was technically real after Steenstrup's 1857 paper, but it did not feel real, in the way that changes how a person understands the ocean, until Kubadera and Maury's camera rolled at 900 meters. And the moment it felt real, the old mythology didn't collapse. It deepened. The thing that had been described in the sagas, illustrated on the Carta Marina, invoked in Tennyson's poem, dramatized in Verne's novel, was now a confirmed biological entity with a mitochondrial genome shared across all the world's deep oceans. The monster had become a species, but it had not stopped being a monster. This is what the long history of these creatures ultimately demonstrates. The kraken, the sea serpent, and the Leviathan survived across centuries and cultures, not because people were simply foolish or because sailors were unreliable witnesses, but because the ocean itself has always been opaque enough to justify their existence. Every culture that has lived alongside deep water has produced some version of the same figure, because every culture has experienced the same uncertainty, the sense that what lies below the surface is fundamentally beyond ordinary comprehension. The monsters were the most honest response available to people working with the evidence at hand, and the evidence, it turned out, was not wrong. It was just incomplete. What the ancient sailors actually saw was never entirely fiction. It was always a real encounter filtered through a limited vocabulary, shaped by a mythic framework that had been built to handle exactly this kind of encounter, and passed forward into traditions that kept refining the description without ever fully resolving it. The ocean kept the mystery alive because the ocean is genuinely mysterious. The technology has changed. The depth of the dark water has not. So what did they actually see? After everything, the chronicles, the carcasses, the illustrations on the margins of maps, the centuries of argument between theologians and naturalists and sailors, comparing notes in harbour taverns, the honest answer is that no single creature explains all of it. The accounts are too varied, the cultures too distant from one another, the described shapes too different across time and geography to collapse into a single biological candidate. Anyone who tells you otherwise is simplifying a record that resists simplification. But that doesn't mean the record is useless. It means it's honest. Start with the kraken, because the kraken has the clearest resolution. The giant squid, Architeuthis, is real, measurable, and now documented on film. Its mantle alone reaches 5 meters, with tentacles extending the total length to something approaching 13 meters in verified specimens, with credible reports suggesting larger individuals have existed. It hunts at depth, surfaces occasionally under conditions we still don't fully understand, and leaves evidence of its presence in the stomach contents of sperm whales and in the scarred skin of animals that have grappled with its suckers. The first footage of a living adult, captured in 2004 at roughly 900 meters depth, showed an 8-meter animal actively hunting a baited line. Not drifting, not passive, but purposeful and large and genuinely startling, even to the scientists who had spent careers arguing for its existence. The Norwegian sailors who described a mass rising from the sea like an island, the monk-shaped creature in the chronicles, the thing that could pull a ship under, they were seeing something real. The scale was exaggerated by fear and distance and the natural tendency of a good story to grow in the retelling. But the animal was there. The sea serpents are more complicated because the sea serpent was never one thing. It was a category, an available shape that the ocean offered up through a variety of encounters, and that sailors and scholars and cartographers then organised under a single label. The oarfish, Regalecus glesner, accounts for a meaningful portion of the sightings. A specimen captured on camera off Taiwan in 2023 was only 2 meters long, yet even at that size its ribbon-like silver body swimming vertically near the surface has an unmistakably alien quality. The species regularly reaches 8 meters, and unverified reports push that to 15. A large oarfish seen from a small vessel, cutting through surface water in its characteristic undulating motion, matches every essential feature of the classic sea serpent account: the length, the sinuous movement, the distinctive head. Add the way it appears and disappears without explanation, surfacing briefly, then descending again into depths no sailor could follow, and the mythology writes itself. But oarfish don't explain the accounts involving bulk, those sightings of something massive rather than something long. For those, the evidence points toward whales, sometimes healthy, sometimes entangled in gear and thrashing, in ways that made them unrecognizable as anything familiar, and toward the carcasses that periodically came ashore in states of decomposition, advanced enough to make identification genuinely difficult. The Stronsey beast, washed up on Orkney in 1808, measured 55 feet and prompted the local Natural History Society to formally declare a new species of sea serpent before later analysis identified it as a decayed basking shark. The creature had not deceived anyone through malice or mythology. It had simply died, and the sea had done to its body what the sea does, and what remained looked like nothing anyone had been prepared to see. Maritime debris, floating kelp masses in certain light, partially surfaced basking sharks with their jaws open. These too entered the record as serpent sightings. The witnesses were not foolish. They were working with incomplete information at a moment of surprise, often from a moving vessel, often in conditions of poor visibility or rough water. Then there is Leviathan, which stands somewhat apart from the others, because Leviathan was never primarily a natural history report. The word itself means twisted or coiled in Hebrew, and it appears 6 times in the biblical text in passages that are openly poetic, dense with imagery, clearly more interested in theological weight than biological description. The creature breathes fire. It is impervious to weapons. It existed before the world was ordered. No single species satisfies all of that, because the text was never written to describe a single species. What the Hebrew writers appear to have done, and what scholars across several generations have argued with considerable force, is construct a mythic image informed by the most dangerous and awe-inspiring animals they had genuine contact with. The Nile crocodile, massive and armoured and cold-eyed, the large whales of the eastern Mediterranean, capable of swamping small vessels. Perhaps the memory, filtered through oral tradition, of encounters with marine animals whose true nature had been partially forgotten by the time the text was written. Modern Hebrew uses Leviathan simply to mean whale. That linguistic convergence is not coincidental. The image was always anchored in something real. It just wasn't reducible to that real thing, because the theological work it was doing required a creature that exceeded what any real animal could fully provide. What all of this amounts to is something genuinely worth sitting with. The most enduring sea monsters in human history were born from real observation. Careful, honest, often courageous observation made by people at the edge of everything they knew. But that observation passed through fear, and through distance, and through the cultural frameworks that each tradition had built to organize experiences that had no other vocabulary. The result was neither pure fact nor pure fiction. It was something in between, a record of genuine encounter that has kept yielding meaning in different forms to every generation that has gone back to read it. The ocean that produced those encounters has not changed in any fundamental way. What lives below 500 meters remains, by any practical measure, largely unknown. New species are still being described from the deep sea every year. The colossal squid was only formally named in 1925, and a juvenile was only captured on film within the past few years. The conditions at depth, the pressure, the cold, the absolute dark, remain hostile to sustained observation in ways that no other environment on Earth matches. The ancient sailors were not wrong to believe the deep water held things that exceeded their comprehension. They were simply the first in a long line of people to discover that it does. What they saw in the end was the ocean being itself.